most people never even try to understand themselves. Every morning, I'd wake up and stare at the same cracked ceiling. Same job, same paycheck, same routine. But somewhere between the silence of dawn and the hum of the city below, something started to break inside me. Not loudly, but quietly like glass under pressure. It wasn't anger. It was awareness. I began to notice how easily people gave up thinking. They scrolled, consumed, complained, and called it being informed. But they weren't growing. They were feeding on noise. And I was one of them. Until one morning, I asked myself a question so simple it shattered everything I believed. What would happen if I became the person I kept waiting for? That day, something in me changed, not instantly, but irreversibly. Build-up begins. I started reading again. Not just books, myself. Every thought, every emotion, every pattern. I dissected my fears like a surgeon working without anesthesia. At first, it felt unbearable. You think you want to know yourself until you start peeling back the layers of who you pretend to be. Every night, I'd sit in my one-room apartment, surrounded by the faint hum of traffic and the glow of my old laptop. While others scrolled through meaningless reels, I studied human nature. Machiavelli, Nietzsche, Seneca, the ruthless poets of the mind. But this wasn't about memorizing quotes. It was about becoming untouchable, psychologically untouchable. I started to see how power actually works, not through control, but through understanding. Most people don't lose because they're weak. They lose because they're predictable, emotionally obvious, easily manipulated. Machiavelli called it the weakness of transparency. But you don't need to read him to feel it. You just need to observe how fast people sell their peace for validation. Every day became an experiment in self-discipline. I'd wake before dawn, study until sunrise, and train my mind to watch instead of react. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped posting opinions online. I realized the loudest people rarely know anything real. It's the quiet ones who are studying while everyone else performs. That's when I began noticing something unsettling. People started to treat me differently, not because I became smarter, but because I became silent. Silence makes people uncomfortable. They project their insecurities into it. They think you're judging them, when in reality, you've just stopped needing their approval. The evolution of the mind. There's a moment every learner reaches, when information turns into identity. It's not about reading anymore. It's about seeing patterns. You begin to see how fear drives the masses, how society thrives on distraction, and how the truth is always hidden in plain sight. Most people don't fail because they lack potential. They fail because they've been trained to seek permission from teachers, from systems, from peers. But self-education breaks that conditioning. It's the quiet rebellion of the modern age. I remember sitting in a cafe once, watching a group of people argue about success. One said it's about connections. Another said it's about luck. And I just sat there thinking, no, it's about clarity. Clarity that comes only when you spend enough time alone to understand your mind's mechanisms. I wasn't special. I just refused to stay blind. Every night, I replaced entertainment with learning. Not for productivity, not for money, but for power. Not the kind you use against others, but the kind that keeps you from being controlled. That's what Machiavelli understood centuries ago. Knowledge isn't power. The application of knowledge, that's power. And that's where most people stop. They collect insights like souvenirs, never realizing the real transformation happens when you embody what you've learned. First turning point, the test. But knowledge is dangerous when you start using it. It exposes the fragility of everything around you, relationships, institutions, even your own habits. One day, I walked into my office and saw the same people gossiping about the same things, complaining about the same pay, the same boss. But this time, I didn't feel superior. I felt distant, like I had stepped out of a simulation. Everyone else was still trapped in. The detachment wasn't arrogance. It was awareness. The more I learned, the less I reacted. The less I reacted, the more control I had over myself. And, strangely, over situations. People noticed. Some said I'd changed. Others said I'd become cold. But I wasn't cold. I was clear. That's when I understood a truth Machiavelli hinted at in The Prince. You must learn to be both lion and fox. To appear harmless, but never be blind. To play along, but never fall asleep. That lesson became my foundation. Every encounter, a test of observation. Every emotion, a mirror. Every mistake, a lesson. I stopped living reactively. I started living strategically. Transition, the lonely path. But there's a price for clarity. It's loneliness. You outgrow conversations. You start hearing the emptiness behind small talk. You start seeing the fear behind people's laughter. And you realize growth disconnects you from the world before it connects you to yourself. It's the kind of loneliness no one warns you about. The one that doesn't come from being unloved, but from being understood by too few. Still, I kept going. Because I knew, while others waited for motivation, I was building momentum. Every book, every idea, every quiet hour. Another brick in the fortress of my mind. I wasn't chasing perfection anymore. I was chasing evolution. You don't realize how heavy awareness is until you carry it alone. The more I learned, the more alien the world felt. Every conversation sounded rehearsed. Every opinion felt borrowed. It's like walking through a masquerade where everyone believes their mask is their face. I used to envy ignorance. How easily people laughed. How effortlessly they filled silence with meaningless words. But once your mind expands, you can't go back to who you were. You can pretend, but you'll always feel the split between who you are and who you used to be. That's the first consequence of daily self-education. You start to see too much. You start reading between lines that others don't even see. You begin to feel truths you can't explain without sounding arrogant or broken. So I learned to stay quiet, not out of fear, but out of efficiency, words or energy, and I had stopped wasting mine on the unready. The mirror phase. There's a stage in transformation when you stop blaming the world. That's when things get dark. Because for the first time, you see the real enemy, your own weakness. All the things I hated in others, laziness, emotional chaos, insecurity, were reflections of myself. That realization burned deeper than any insult ever could. It forced me to turn every criticism inward. Each time someone triggered me, I'd ask, what truth am I avoiding? Each time I felt envy, I'd ask, what discipline have I neglected? Each time I felt judged, I'd ask, why do I still need to be seen? That's when I realized education isn't about knowledge. It's about ego death. To truly educate yourself is to dismantle the illusions that keep you safe, to face the parts of you that would rather remain ignorant. Because ignorance feels like peace, but Machiavellian wisdom doesn't seek peace. It seeks power through clarity. And clarity is always painful. The silence of growth. Growth doesn't look like victory. It looks like silence, like being misunderstood by people you once admired, like walking away from arguments you know you could win, like smiling at mockery because you understand the fear behind it. One night, I found myself sitting in my apartment again, lights off, the glow of the street spilling through the blinds. I opened one of Machiavelli's letters, not The Prince, but his lesser-known correspondence, where he wrote about exile. He described how, after being cast out of politics, he spent his nights reading, thinking, and preparing for the moment the world would need him again. That struck me deeply, because exile wasn't just political, it was spiritual. Every thinker, every learner, every self-educator lives in exile for a while, separated from the noise of society, building silently in the dark. That night I realized isolation isn't punishment, it's incubation. The world calls it loneliness. The wise call it preparation, breaking the old identity. As the months passed, I began to outgrow my own reflection. The things that once defined me, career, reputation, opinions, started to feel like costumes. I wasn't pretending anymore. I was becoming. But transformation is brutal because it destroys before it rebuilds. People who once admired you start to pull away. They say you've changed, and you have, but they don't understand why. They see arrogance where there is clarity. They see distance where there is peace. I learned to stop explaining my evolution to people still defending their stagnation. That's the quiet price of rising. You outgrow comfort, validation, and sometimes love. But I kept educating myself because knowledge was the only thing that didn't betray me. Books became my allies, solitude my mentor, and experience my exam. The rebellion within. One day, a colleague laughed at me for spending lunch reading a book instead of chatting. He said, "You think all that philosophy is going to make you rich?" I didn't answer, because that's what he couldn't see. I wasn't learning for wealth. I was learning for leverage. Most people chase external power, but real power is internal. It's the ability to remain composed while others lose their minds. It's not about control over others. It's about control over self. That's when Machiavelli's wisdom took root in me, not as advice, but as instinct. He understood that in a world ruled by emotion, the calm mind becomes the apex predator. So I made a vow to myself that day. Every single day, I will learn something that makes me harder to manipulate. That vow changed everything. Because once you start seeing knowledge as armor, every piece of information becomes a weapon. You stop being offended. You start being observant. You stop competing. You start strategizing. You stop talking. You start listening. And slowly, you begin to see how most people reveal their entire psychology within the first few sentences they speak. The split between two worlds. With time, I began living in two realities. In one, I was surrounded by ordinary life, co-workers, conversations, laughter. In the other, I was in constant study, decoding behavior, analyzing motives, mapping patterns. The two worlds never fully aligned. Sometimes it felt like I was living behind a glass wall, watching people live on autopilot, while I quietly took notes. But the more I learned, the more detached I became. Not emotionless, just unmoved. Detachment isn't coldness. It's clarity without noise. And once you reach that state, you start noticing how chaos collapses before stillness. People who once intimidated you now seem predictable. Their anger, jealousy, gossip, all just symptoms of unexamined minds. I realized education doesn't make you superior. It makes you sovereign. The test of detachment. Detachment, however, gets tested. One evening, an argument broke out at work. Someone accused me of being too calm, of not caring enough. In the past, I would have defended myself. But that night, I just looked at him, not with contempt, but with understanding. Because I knew what he didn't. Emotional chaos is a language of the untrained mind. He was reacting from fear, and fear seeks witnesses. But I refused to be one. Later that night, I walked home through the city, rain falling, lights blurring in the puddles, and I realized how far I'd come. Not financially, not socially, but internally. There's a kind of power in being unprovoked. It's the kind of power that doesn't need to be seen to be felt. It's invisible but undeniable like gravity. That's the quiet mark of the self-educated mind. It stops needing to prove itself, because its proof is in its peace. That night, I wrote a line in my journal. I am no longer chasing success. I'm preparing for it. Because that's what daily education really is. Preparation. You don't rise because you suddenly get lucky. You rise because one day, the world needs exactly the person you've been becoming in silence. And when that moment comes, you're ready, not by chance, but by choice. There's a moment when learning stops being an act of consumption and becomes an act of creation. It doesn't happen suddenly. It creeps in like dawn, slow, subtle, inevitable. One morning, you wake up and realize you're no longer learning just to escape mediocrity. You're learning to build something of your own. That's where I found myself. After months of silent study, observation, and detachment, my mind had changed. I no longer saw people as threats or obstacles. I saw them as patterns. Each word, each gesture, each hesitation, a code revealed what they feared, what they wanted, and how they moved. And with that understanding came something dangerous, power, but not the loud kind that demands attention. This was a quiet power, a kind that moved in silence and struck with precision, the kind Machiavelli admired. Influence without display, the shift in perception. When you start thinking differently, the world starts reacting differently. People sense when you stop needing them. They can feel when your validation no longer depends on their approval. At work, I noticed it immediately. The same people who once dismissed me began to measure their words more carefully around me. It wasn't fear, it was respect, though they didn't know why. I had stopped playing their game, and suddenly, I was the only one not dancing to invisible music. That's when I understood what Machiavelli meant when he said, "Men judge more by the eye than by the hand." People don't see your effort, they see your energy. When your presence changes, their perception shifts automatically. That's the hidden reward of daily self-education. While others seek shortcuts, you become the person who doesn't need them. Strategic isolation. Every day after work, I return to my apartment. No noise, no parties, no distractions. Just me, my notes, and a single dim light. The world outside celebrated weekends. I celebrated progress. Most people chase pleasure because they can't stand silence. But silence had become my strongest ally. In silence, you can hear what your mind has been trying to tell you all along. You begin to notice your emotional triggers, your illusions of control, your need for validation, and you dismantle them one by one. And when you do that long enough, something strange happens. Your focus becomes frightening. You start moving differently, thinking differently. You no longer seek attention because your awareness itself becomes addictive. You begin to realize that the world rewards those who understand it, not those who complain about it. The art of observation. Knowledge without observation is noise. But once you learn to observe, everything becomes a lesson. I started to notice how leaders carried themselves, how they used silence, posture, timing, how they never rushed to speak, how they made others reveal their cards first. I began to apply it slowly. In meetings, I'd wait. I'd let others debate, argue, interrupt each other. Then, when everyone was exhausted, I'd summarize the entire discussion in one calm sentence. Not loud, not proud, just precise. And every time, people nodded, not because I was smarter, but because I had observed longer. That's when I learned another truth Machiavelli hid within his writings. The patient observer controls the impulsive actor. It's not about intelligence. It's about endurance, the discipline to wait until emotion blinds your opponent, and then act with calm clarity. The unseen training ground. The world doesn't see your study sessions, your notebooks, your late nights, and it doesn't care. It only sees results. And that's perfect, because the less they see, the more you build undisturbed. Every day became a quiet repetition of small victories. Wake, read, reflect, observe, adjust, continue. No one clapped for me. No one noticed the transformation. But every morning, I could feel the gap widening between who I was and who I was becoming. People called it obsession, but it wasn't obsession. It was momentum. And momentum is the most underestimated form of power. Because once you have it, you stop needing motivation. You become unstoppable, even on your worst days. The encounter, a test of composure. Then came the test, the one every self-educated mind eventually faces. It was a Friday evening, a client meeting that turned hostile, voices raised, accusations thrown. Everyone reacted, everyone defended, except me. I just watched, not with arrogance, but with awareness. Every person in that room was being puppeted by emotion. And emotion, I realized, is the easiest lever to control. When the shouting finally died down, I spoke, slowly, calmly, logically, not to win the argument, but to neutralize it. Within minutes, the energy shifted. People leaned in, softened, listened. The deal was salvaged, not through charm or luck, but through control. That night, walking home, I understood something Machiavelli had implied, but never said outright. If you can control emotion, yours or theirs, you control outcomes. That's the essence of power. And that's why most people never have it. The mirror of reality. The more I mastered my reactions, the more predictable the world became. Not because people changed, but because I learned to read the psychology behind every behavior. Fear, insecurity, desire. Those are the real currencies of human nature. Once you understand what drives people, manipulation becomes unnecessary. You don't need to deceive, you simply anticipate. And anticipation is the purest form of dominance. That's when I stopped chasing results, because results are just symptoms of understanding. I realized the goal of education isn't to know everything, it's to perceive accurately. And once perception sharpens, success becomes inevitable. The psychological ascension. I started to see how every lesson I'd learned in isolation was now reshaping reality itself. The way people spoke to me, the way opportunities appeared, the way chaos around me seemed to slow down. It was as if the world was revealing its blueprint. Not because I was special, but because I'd finally learned the language it was written in. That's when the Machiavellian principle made perfect sense. Fortune favors a prepared mind. Luck doesn't exist. Only alignment does. And alignment is created through education. Every moment I had spent studying, reflecting, detaching, it wasn't wasted time. It was a slow sharpening of the blade. And now, everything I touched began to bend toward precision, the separation of paths. But with rise comes separation. The more you grow, the fewer people you can talk to. The air at the top isn't lonely because of isolation. It's lonely because of elevation. People who once laughed with you begin to feel threatened by your silence. They sense your composure as judgment. They start pulling away, not because you've changed too much, but because they haven't changed at all. It hurt at first. But then I realized this is what Machiavelli meant when he spoke about perception. To remain respected, one must be seen as different. That's the paradox of growth. To connect with the masses, you must once have been one of them. To rise above them, you must learn to let go. He once thought knowledge would make him powerful. He was wrong. Knowledge doesn't make you powerful. It makes you aware, and awareness is agony. He began to see what others couldn't. He saw manipulation hidden behind kindness. He saw weakness dressed as virtue. He saw how the world rewarded performance, not sincerity. He no longer envied anyone, because he understood everyone. And that's the curse of self-education. You stop belonging. He stopped engaging in small talk. He stopped explaining himself to people who had no interest in understanding. He stopped chasing validation because he saw it for what it truly was, a leash. Most people don't want truth. They want comfort. They want to feel good about their blindness. They want noise, not silence. They want belief, not reality. So he learned to smile silently, to nod when people lied, to keep his truth locked inside like a loaded weapon. Sound, slow rainfall against old glass, a steady rhythm of solitude. The years passed, and his hunger didn't fade. It evolved. He no longer wanted to be better than others. He wanted to be untouchable. So he consumed philosophy like oxygen, Machiavelli, Marcus Aurelius, Nietzsche, not as quotes, but as systems. He began seeing life like a chessboard, patterns, moves, consequences. He realized people destroy themselves not because they're evil, but because they're undisciplined. They want success without strategy, love without standards, peace without solitude. Machiavelli had said, "The man who wishes to be good all the time will come to ruin among the many who are not good." He finally understood. Goodness without wisdom is a suicide pact. To stay ahead, one must evolve, beyond morality, beyond emotion, beyond noise. He stopped living by rules. He started living by principles. Rules were made to control the masses. Principles were forged to guide the strong. His principle was simple: never stop becoming dangerous. Not violent, but powerful enough that no one could ever cage him again. He built a mind sharper than any weapon. He trained his emotions to obey logic. He studied psychology not to fix himself, but to disarm others. Every book became a mirror. Every failure, a textbook. Every betrayal, a lesson in strategy. He no longer hated the world. He studied it. He dissected it like an organism, seeing what made it pulse, what made it rot. And through it all, he realized something haunting. The more you rise, the lonelier you become, because every level of understanding demands a level of isolation, and most people will never follow you there. Sound fades into the quiet hum of candlelight. One night, as he sat in silence, he wrote a single line in his notebook: to stay ahead of 99% of people, read what they won't, think what they can't, do what they fear. And beneath it, he drew a small circle. Inside that circle, he wrote one word, discipline, because without it, all knowledge rots into vanity. Without it, dreams collapse into delusion. Without it, the mind eats itself. Education was no longer a habit for him. It was a ritual, a sacred war against mediocrity. He wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. He was preparing for something bigger, darker, unseen. Because the man who reads every day doesn't just learn. He becomes a kind of man others fear to misunderstand. Music deepens, slow, reflective, cinematic tone building toward realization. He began to test his knowledge in silence. He watched how people reacted to subtle truths. He learned when to speak and when to let silence destroy. He didn't fight anymore. He simply observed. He didn't argue, he calculated. And over time, the world began to bend toward him. People began to listen differently. Enemies began to tread lightly. Because true intelligence doesn't shout, it radiates. He had become what Machiavelli described as a lion with the mind of a fox. Powerful enough to act, wise enough to wait. The difference between ordinary and extraordinary was now obvious. Ordinary men react. Extraordinary men reflect before they react. Sound. The rain stops. Silence. Then a faint heartbeat, steady and calm. He smiled faintly, closing his eyes. The journey of self-education had not given him peace. It had given him clarity. And in a world drowning in distraction, clarity was the ultimate power. He finally understood what it meant to be free, to see the world as it is, and still choose who to become. He no longer chased anything. Not people, not validation, not even success. He simply became. For years, he had studied everything that could be studied. Psychology, power, philosophy, history, the subtle dance of manipulation and human weakness. But tonight, as the world slept, he realized the most profound truth of all. Education was never about knowing more than others. It was about knowing yourself better than your past self. Every lesson had cost him something, a piece of innocence, a relationship, a night of peace, a version of himself that couldn't survive the truth. He had paid in full. The more he learned, the more he detached. The more he detached, the more he saw clearly. Clarity doesn't come with comfort. It comes with sacrifice. Because once your eyes adjust to truth, you can never unsee the illusions that rule this world. He understood why most people never truly learn. Learning demands transformation, and transformation always requires pain. People don't fear ignorance. They fear the death of who they are. They'd rather stay blind and rebuild themselves from the ashes of awareness. But he didn't want comfort. He wanted mastery. Soft piano fades and melancholy reflective. He remembered something Machiavelli once implied in The Prince. It's not the strongest who survive, nor the kindest. It's the most adaptable. Adaptability became his religion. Every morning, before the city woke, he read. Not to impress, but to stay awake in a sleeping world. Not to compete, but to keep his mind sharpened like a blade against time. He knew that every man who stops learning begins dying long before his body does. He saw it everywhere. The dull eyes of men repeating their days. The trapped smiles of those addicted to comfort. The empty souls scrolling endlessly through illusions. He had escaped that loop, but at a cost. Solitude had become his companion. Discipline his only friend. And silence his teacher. He no longer envied the loud or the popular. He pitied them. Because they were trapped in a game they didn't even know they were playing. He wasn't playing anymore. He was observing. To be educated, he realized, was to move unseen, to walk through chaos untouched, to speak only when words were stronger than silence, to carry a calm so deep that even storms look for permission before approaching. He had become the kind of man the world misunderstands. Quiet, detached, unreadable. But that's what happens when you outgrow the noise. When your mind becomes too precise for manipulation, too patient for panic, too aware for weakness. He wasn't arrogant. He was awake. And that's rarer than genius. Sound. A slow, soft heartbeat. steady and calm, symbolizes control. Now, every night before sleep, he asked himself one question. Did I evolve today or did I repeat myself? Because repetition is death disguised as routine. And evolution, real evolution, is war. A war against comfort, distraction, and your own ego. Most men don't lose to others. They lose to themselves. Every day, silently, comfortably. But not him. He had built a fortress inside his mind, stone by stone, word by word, truth by truth. And from that fortress, he didn't attack the world. He watched it destroy itself. That's the irony of wisdom. The smarter you get, the less you interfere. Because you finally understand, people aren't ready for the truths that would free them. So he let them sleep, and he kept learning. Music shifts, quieter, deeper, cinematic pause. He began to see the world like a great machine. Every man a cog, turning for something he doesn't understand. Every woman chasing validation from ghosts. Every generation repeating the same stories, just with new screens. But in that repetition, he found freedom. Because once you see the pattern, you can escape it. He understood the hidden law of all power. To predict people, study history. To control yourself, study philosophy. He had done both. Now, nothing surprised him. Nothing disturbed him. He had outgrown reaction itself. That's what education does when pursued with discipline. It doesn't make you loud. It makes you calm, unshakable, unreachable, and that calm is terrifying to those still ruled by emotion. Sound, fire crackles, symbolizing transformation. He finally smiled a small, knowing smile. He wasn't finished. He never would be, because education wasn't a goal. It was a path without end. Every book he read opened another door. Every insight revealed another flaw. Every truth whispered another challenge. You're not done yet. He didn't see perfection anymore. He sought depth. Perfection was an illusion. Depth was eternal. And the deeper he went, the more he realized. The ultimate wisdom is to know how little you truly know. That's what separated him from the 99%. They wanted answers. He wanted awareness. They wanted comfort. He wanted control. They wanted attention. He wanted peace. That was the gap. The silent, invisible gap between the educated and the enlightened. And he had crossed it. Music swells, emotional crescendo, then fades into a quiet hum. Now, he lived his days with a new rule. Never waste energy proving yourself to the blind. Just keep walking toward the light. That was his version of peace. To know more, yet need less. To care deeply, yet remain detached. To stand among people, yet belong to no one. He was no longer learning to escape weakness. He was learning to understand it. Because only through understanding can you transcend it. Machiavelli would have called that the ultimate form of power. The power of knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to walk away. He had mastered all three. Sound. The wind softens. The last candle goes out. Only his voice remains. He whispered to himself, barely audible, as if speaking to time itself. Educate yourself every day. Not for the world, but for the day you must face it alone. And in that silence he felt something rare. Not pride, not joy, but understanding. He had become what most men feared. A man who no longer needed the world's approval to define his worth. His mind was no longer a battlefield. It was a kingdom, ruled not by desire, but by awareness. And from that throne of silence, he finally understood Machiavelli's secret. Power doesn't belong to those who seek it. It belongs to those who prepare for it. He closed his eyes. The night was long, but his mind was eternal. The world would keep spinning. People would keep sleeping. And he would keep learning. Because the moment you stop educating yourself, you fall back into the crowd you once escaped. Soft piano outro, a single note fading into silence. Narrator's final line. The wise don't compete. They evolve in silence until the world wonders how they got so far ahead.